Unless we end the existing private monopoly to create money, governments will have no cash to finance the fast turnover from fossil fuels to clean energy, upon which the future of the planet depends. The present banking and financial system is, in reality, a global fraud. One giant Ponzi scheme, and it is the main contributor to some strange anomalies. A couple of years ago, I read in the newspaper that 88 families own half of all the world's wealth. A year later, I think it was, I read that 80 families owned half of the world's wealth. A few weeks ago, I read that 62 families own half of the world's wealth. Can you imagine anything so incredible? The 62 families who could put their houses in this one street somewhere own half of everything. You know, Tokyo, New York, Kingston, Toronto, Paris, London, Athens, the whole world, half of it, they own. And that is directly a result of the banking system that we have inherited and which has been so entrenched for so long. At the same time, a report in the Globe and Mail just not long ago indicated that the combined world debt had reached an all-time high. There has never been as much debt in the world as there is at this moment, and it's still rising. How high can it go? Well, eventually, of course, it collapses and we have another terrible bust. I know many mainline economists, and not one of them has explained how you can escape from a mountain of debt by borrowing more. Neat trick. Up to my ears in debt, borrow some more and get out of debt. Well, utter nonsense. It's a delusion, if that isn't an oxymoron. Fortunately, there are a few radical thinkers with see-through glasses waiting in the wings at this time of crisis. It doesn't matter what you call it, positive money, stimulation money, or growth money, it all adds up to the same thing. Canada's economy and the world economy desperately need a massive infusion of government-created debt-free money to dilute the all-debt system and give it life. There is no other solution, period. Well, that is not news to me, probably not to most of you. Decades ago, I paid to have the late Mike McCracken's company, Informetrica Limited of Ottawa, do some simulations on what would happen if we introduced a little debt-free money into the system. And when the first simulations were done, it was interesting. His vice president phoned me and said, the results are so good, they're scary. Scary good. It was those simulations that finally convinced Pierre Trudeau that we were on the right track. But by then, of course, he was no longer Prime Minister. And we had his best wishes. But all party leaders since have been too busy to sit down even for a half an hour and discuss the issue, which says something about them. Well, now is the time. So a number of associates, like Jerry, and others have joined forces again to urge the government to forthwith introduce a supplementary budget that will enable them to keep all their promises and more, and make Canada the model upon which a revived world economy can be based. But first, it will be necessary to review some monetary history and the decisions that got us into this present mess. I apologize to those of you who know all of this by heart, but I want to put it on the record again so that we can pass it on to others who have never had time or enough interest to listen. I have an interesting quote here that I would like to read to you. The quote is as follows: "Banking was conceived in iniquity and born in sin. The bankers own the earth. Take it away from them, but leave them the power to create money, and with the flick of a pen, they will create enough money to buy it back again. However, take that power away from them, and all the great fortunes like mine will disappear. And they ought to disappear, for the world would be a happier and better world to live in. But if you wish to remain the slaves of bankers and pay the cost of your own slavery, let them continue to create money." And that quote was Sir Josiah, later Baron Stamp, a director of the Bank of England from 1928 to 1941. Well, before 1640, it was the custom of wealthy merchants to keep their money in the mint in the Tower of London. And in 1640, Charles I, a very naughty man, I must say, seized it all, confiscated. So the wealthy had to start to look for a new place to keep their gold and silver. And they decided on the goldsmiths of Lombard Street, because the goldsmiths already had strong boxes that were fireproof that they had made to keep their own valuables. So that is where the rich people turned to keep their money. The goldsmiths accepted the deposits, gave them receipts, which became known as goldsmiths' receipts, which are sort of the precursor of banknotes. And it was with the understanding that they would be able to lend this money to their friends if it wasn't being used, if it wasn't being called out. Well, it wasn't long before they found that they could issue more receipts than they had gold in their vaults. Why was that? Because the people didn't all come in at the same time to get their gold. If you're going to buy a fur coat for your wife, you don't go in and get a big bundle of gold and take it off and give it to the furrier. You just take the receipts. So much easier and faster. But what the goldsmiths did was a scam, issuing receipts against gold they didn't have. It was illegal. But it wasn't long before it was legitimized by the Bank of England. King William's crushing war in France left him with a desperate need to build up the navy, and he had no money and he had no credit. And so what was decided was to establish the Bank of England and give it special powers and privileges. The rich people in London put in £1,200,000 of gold and silver and lent it all to the king at 8%, which is a pretty high interest rate for a government guaranteed loan. And the king, in return, allowed them to print, P-R-I-N-T, literally, 1,200,000 pounds in banknotes and lend it to their rich friends at high interest. So in effect, the Bank of England was able to lend the same money once to the king and once to their customers and friends and collect interest from each. Twice the interest on the money they had. And that was known as leverage. And the banknotes that were put into circulation, they weren't the first money issued by banks in the modern era, but they were the first of great and lasting significance in the English-speaking world. This arrangement was very similar in principle to the one that had been developed by the goldsmiths. By lending the same money twice, the bank could double the interest that it received on its capital. Well, bankers are by nature a greedy lot, and they weren't satisfied with just getting double interest on their money. So they started lobbying and doing everything they could to increase that leverage. And in the early years of the 20th century, federally chartered banks in the United States had to have reserves of 25% in gold in their vaults. So they were allowed to lend the same money 4 times. When I was a young man in Canada, our banks had to have 8% cash in their vaults against their deposits, which meant that they could lend the same money 12.5 times. Well, then in recent times, with the advent of monetarism and the monetarist revolution inspired by Milton Friedman and his colleagues at the University of Chicago, and the elimination of cash reserves in favor of a new system labeled capital adequacy, which should have been labeled capital inadequacy, the leverage soared. In the US, it rose from about 12.5 times in 1974 to 25 or 30 times in the 1980s. Imagine getting 25 or 30 times the interest on the same money. Well, this incredible abuse occurred because even the ridiculously low capital requirements of the Bank for International Settlements were never properly enforced. Well, following the deliberately induced crash of 2007, how many of you have seen The Big Short? Hands up. Quite a few of you. Well, if you haven't, see it, because this is the way Wall Street works. But they brought down the system in 2007. And then afterward, the G20, the leaders of the G20, instead of saying the system is broken, we have to fix it, they tried to patch up this leaky and immoral ship on the basis of a leverage of roughly 20-1. The deck is still stacked in favor of the bankers, as 9 years of anemic growth has shown. Before continuing, I would like to say that there are thousands of people working in the banking industry who are just as nice as we are. But they don't really understand the system. I've even talked to bank managers who don't. It's just the top families at the apex of the cartel who are so callous, greedy, and ruthless. Well, our system here at the present time is very simple. I have some coins here in my pocket. I don't know if I can find them or not, but oh yeah, here's some coins. That's legal tender created by the Mint in Ottawa, but it's less than 1% of our money supply. And then in my other pocket, I think I have a couple of bills, a couple left, I'm running short. But They're printed by the Bank of Canada and their legal tender, but they only represent 2 to 3% of our money supply. All of the rest, about 97% of all existing money, consists of bank deposits. And that is not real money. Banks don't have any real money to lend. No cash. You're lucky if your bank has 1 or 2 cents in its vaults for every dollar you think you have in the bank. What the banks lend you is their credit. And the way it works is grand larceny. The system works this way. If you want $35,000 to buy a new car, you go to your bank and say, I'd like to borrow $35,000. They'll ask you, what collateral have you got? Some stocks or bonds or second mortgage on your cottage, or failing that, co-signer, somebody in the family that has some money. And as soon as they're satisfied with your collateral, they'll ask you to sign a note for $35,000. Demand note plus interest at the prime rate plus, I always say, 1 or 2% depending on the color of your eyes. But maybe I'm being a little facetious there. And as soon as you sign that note, they go over to their computer and put in a few taps, and presto, you have $35,000 in your account that you can go out and spend to buy the car. The important thing is that seconds later, that money did not exist. It was created out of thin air, so to speak. Well, I have a lot of friends, including some banking friends, who said, well, the money the bank lends you today is something that somebody else deposited the day before. Not true. It is almost fully lent out, and the chances of it being what somebody put in the day before is infinitesimal. The money was manufactured especially for you. Well, to add insult to injury, banks only need to have 5 cents in capital for every dollar they create. I say 5 cents of what I call blood, sweat money, which has to be repaid at 100 cents on the dollar, plus interest. Wow. In effect, the richest, most powerful people in the world are buying up assets for 5 cents on the dollar. Well, you can get very rich that way. If you only have to put up 5 cents for the dollar to buy the Empire State Building or the TD Bank Building or whatever, you can get a lot of buildings for a very small amount of money. And that is how they have accumulated this vast, vast wealth that they presently have. So you can understand why reformers are recommending an alternative that is both just and workable, because it has to be both. It is based on our own Canadian history for the period 1939 to 1974. Graham Towers, the first and arguably the best governor of the Bank of Canada, said money was just a book entry. Well, if he were alive today, he'd say it's just a computer entry. That's all it is. A little history taken from the governor's answers to parliamentary questions on banking and commerce, 1939, sort of sets the stage for the debate today. And this was a question. Will you tell me why a government with power to create money should give that power away to a private monopoly and then borrow that which Parliament can create itself back at interest to the point of national bankruptcy. Mr. Towers, quote, "If Parliament wants to change the form of operating the banking system, then certainly that is within the power of Parliament." Page 394. At one point, the question turned to the impending war, World War II. Question: you have agreed that banks do create money. So as far as war is concerned, will there be no difficulty in raising the means of financing whatever the requirements may be? Towers, the answer: the possibilities depend on men and materials. Question: so where we have an abundance of men and materials, you have no difficulty under the present system in putting forth the medium of exchange that is necessary to put the men and materials to work. Mr. Towers, that is right. It is appropriate to this present situation. We have men and women, and we have materials, we have the capacity. The one thing we haven't got is money.